Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. What if I told you the United States is trying to run a war strategy that pushes in two opposite directions at the same time? More pressure, more troops, more presence, but also signals of restraint, talk of winding things down, openings for negotiation. At first glance, that feels like confusion, but it's not. What you're looking at is something far more deliberate and far more dangerous. A strategy built on tension, and to understand where this is going, you have to understand why that tension exists in the first place. Let's start with what everyone notices first, the hard power. Recent developments show a clear pattern: military pressure is not going away. In fact, it's being reinforced. We're seeing additional marine deployments into the region. Amphibious readiness groups moving earlier than scheduled, airborne units placed on standby, air and naval patrols increasing around one of the most critical choke points on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz, and you cannot overstate how important that waterway is. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow strip. So when military activity increases there, it's not just about Iran, it's about the global economy. It's about energy prices in Europe, in Asia, in the United States. It's about inflation. It's about political stability far beyond the Middle East. Now layer on top of that something even more interesting. There have been discussions, some confirmed, some deliberately ambiguous, about potential operations targeting high-value Iranian assets, strategic oil infrastructure, sensitive facilities tied to nuclear development. Critical nodes that, if disrupted, would send a shock through the entire system. But here's what makes this different. The messaging around these possibilities is not clear. It's intentionally unstable. One day, a possibility is raised. The next day, it's denied. Then it comes back again in a slightly different form. This is not bad communication. This is strategic ambiguity. It forces Iran to prepare for multiple outcomes at once. It complicates their decision-making. It raises the cost of inaction. And at the same time, it sends a message to the rest of the world. The United States has options, and it's not showing all of them. That's the hard side of the equation. But now let's shift to the part that confuses people. Because at the exact same time all of this is happening, there's a completely different tone coming out of Washington. You hear language suggesting that the conflict is nearing its end. You hear statements emphasizing that key objectives have already been achieved. You hear openness, carefully worded, but very real toward negotiations. And then there's a third layer that doesn't get enough attention, but might be the most important of all. The economic and alliance messaging. There's increasing frustration directed at allies over burden sharing, especially when it comes to securing global trade routes. The logic is simple. If the Strait of Hormuz stays open, it benefits not just the United States, but countries across Europe and Asia. So why should Washington carry the entire cost? That question is not just rhetorical, it's strategic. Because it hints at a possible shift in how the United States wants to operate going forward. Less direct enforcement, more shared responsibility, and potentially more transactional arrangements. In other words, a move from "we guarantee global security" to "security" comes with a price. That's not a retreat in the traditional sense. It's a redefinition of the role. So now you have two forces moving at the same time: escalation and de-escalation. Pressure and restraint. From the outside, that looks like contradiction, but in reality, it's leverage. Because the goal is not just to win a fight. The goal is to shape what happens after the fight. And that's where things get complicated. Because this is where the strategy starts running into its own limits. Let's talk about the first major constraint. Pressure doesn't scale forever. At the beginning of a conflict, applying overwhelming pressure can produce real results. It creates shock. It disrupts systems. It forces the other side into a reactive position. But over time, something changes. The target adapts. They decentralize. They absorb the pressure. They learn. And once that happens, Every additional step becomes less effective than the last. But here's the problem: the cost doesn't go down, it goes up. So now you're in a situation where you have to invest more to get less. That's not just a military problem, that's a strategic trap. Because if you keep escalating, you risk triggering a much larger conflict. But if you stop, you risk losing credibility, and credibility matters, especially for a global power. Now, let's move to the second constraint. The battlefield is no longer isolated. In the past, wars could be somewhat contained. Today, that's almost impossible, especially in a region tied directly to global energy flows. If instability disrupts the Strait of Hormuz even partially, you don't just see local consequences, you see global ripple effects. Oil prices spike, shipping insurance rates surge, supply chains tighten, markets react instantly, and suddenly, what looked like a military success starts generating economic pressure everywhere else. This creates a paradox that's very hard to manage. You can win tactically and still lose control of the outcome, because the outcome is not just determined by what happens on the battlefield. It's determined by how the entire system reacts, and that system includes energy markets, financial markets, allied governments, domestic voters. Now every military decision carries economic consequences. And those consequences can come back to you faster than you expect. Now we get to the third constraint, the one that defines how wars actually end. The tension between declaring victory and actually leaving. Every administration wants to say the same thing: we achieved our objectives. That matters for public perception. It matters for political legitimacy. It matters for history. But saying it and acting on it are two very different things, because leaving creates risk. If you leave too early, you risk collapse. If you stay too long, you risk entanglement. And sometimes, the only way to leave safely is to temporarily increase your presence. You reinforce, you stabilize, you secure key points, and only then do you step back. But from the outside, that looks like elation. So now you're sending mixed signals. You say the mission is nearly complete, but you deploy more forces. You say you don't want a wider war, but you keep military options open. You signal negotiation, but you maintain pressure. That's not necessarily incoherent, but it is extremely difficult to manage, because every signal you send is interpreted differently by different audiences. Your adversary reads it one way. Your allies read it another. Your domestic audience reads it in a completely different way. And if those interpretations drift too far apart, the strategy starts to break down. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us something fundamental about modern power. Military force is incredibly effective at destroying things, but it is much less effective at creating stable outcomes. You can dismantle infrastructure, you can eliminate targets, you can dominate in a conventional sense, but stability depends on factors that are far harder to control: political structures, economic incentives, regional dynamics, perception, legitimacy. And those things don't respond to force in the same way. This is why so many conflicts over the past 2 decades have followed a similar pattern: rapid initial success, followed by long-term uncertainty, because building order is harder than breaking it. So, how do you read what happens next? If you really want to understand where this is going, don't just watch the military headlines. Watch the system-level indicators. Watch how easily ships move through key waterways. Watch insurance premiums for shipping companies. Watch how energy markets react. Watch whether global supply chains stabilize or remain tense. Those signals tell you something deeper than any official statement. They tell you whether the system is absorbing the shock or still under stress. And that brings us to the real question: not whether the United States can apply pressure. It clearly can. Not whether it can achieve tactical success. It already has. The real question is this: can it control what happens next? Can it apply enough force to shape outcomes without triggering consequences that spiral beyond control? Can it maintain credibility without getting pulled into a larger, longer conflict? Can it step back without appearing to lose? That is the balancing act. And it's one of the hardest things any government can attempt, because the margin for error is extremely small. Push too hard, and you risk escalation. Pull back too quickly, and you risk instability. Stay too long, and you risk entrapment. Leave too soon, and you risk collapse. There is no perfect move, only trade-offs. And history is very clear about one thing: these kinds of strategies can work. But they depend on timing, on discipline, on clear signaling, and on a deep understanding of how different parts of the system interact. Because if any one piece is misread, if any signal is misinterpreted, if any reaction is underestimated, the entire balance can shift. And when that happens in a region as critical as the Middle East, the consequences don't stay contained. They spread through energy markets, through financial systems, through political alliances, across the entire world. So when you look at what's happening right now, don't think of it as confusion. Think of it as controlled tension, a strategy that relies on holding opposing forces in place at the same time: pressure and restraint, strength and flexibility, action and hesitation. It's not stable, it's not comfortable, but it's intentional. The real question is not whether this strategy makes sense on paper. The real question is whether it can hold under pressure. Because if it holds, it can reshape the outcome. But if it breaks, it won't just change the course of the conflict, it will redefine it. And once that happens, there's no easy way back. Thanks for watching.